Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is episode 8 in the series, What Makes Marriages Work? In this episode, Dr. Scoresby talks about destructive patterns couples can get into that may seem harmless because they seem natural, but they can catch one or both people in an unproductive cycle of behavior. He talks about how these behaviors can prevent happiness and then explains how to avoid these traps. Visit mattersmostmedia.org to find more about the podcast and firstanswers.com to find tons of relationship resources.
I'm speaking about marital traps. And I call them traps because they might catch one or both people in a marriage in an unproductive cycle of behavior. They are traps because they seem like they are natural, and therefore they might appear to be harmless, but they are not. The time and effort to participate in them prevent a married couple from achieving the happiness they hope marriage will bring. To understand why this is important, please consider the idea that the interaction or communication between married people becomes repetitive. It is called redundant because, good or bad, it tends to become stable over time and will characterize the relationship thereafter in some degree. A trap is something that becomes captured in this process, and if perpetuated, it will become habitual. Here's an example. Suppose a couple get into a small spat, and to try and stop it, the wife decides she should leave. To her surprise, her husband tells her she cannot leave, and as she moves to the door, he gets in front of her to prevent her from leaving. Once established, this reaction from each person can be repeated and, unless checked, becomes what is known as a pattern of behavior. Or imagine that a couple has made an appointment to meet for dinner. One is late, and the other is feeling unimportant and is angry. When the tardy spouse arrives, the waiting spouse criticizes. What ensues is an argument with one side focused on what the other is about, the one who is late and the other who criticizes. This can become a pattern of behavior, and every time there's an appointment, it may be carried out in a similar fashion. Now, after these types of behavior are repeated, it occurs to the couple they are repetitive. And so, when several of them exist, couples who are in argument will use language such as, "You always do this," or "You never do that," and even this will become part of the marriage script. It's not true, of course, that any person always does something or never does something. Now, is it possible for positive and loving exchanges to become redundant too? Yes, it is. And so that is why a wise couple will introduce many different forms of positive behavior and practice them so they become a habit. To be the most happy and satisfied, married people will usually need to be on their best game at least some of the time. But the truth for most people is that we're not always in top form, and we have some forms of behavior that are not only not productive, but may be hurtful. So how do we learn what the good things are, and if we knew them, would we do them? They're obviously not obvious. A lot of people think that pleasing the other person, for example, is what will work, and so they set out to make sure the other person is pleased, even if it requires them to subordinate themselves in order to make sure the other person is pleased. On the surface, this may seem reasonable, even a good thing, and on many occasions, pleasing each other does in fact bring satisfaction and happiness. But it is more complicated than that. In the process of one person trying to please the other, he or she may subordinate their own needs, and this becomes a pattern. One diminishes himself, hoping to give to the other what is wanted. It is then that a couple will discover that when somebody habitually seeks to please, and does so out of an obligation or misplaced belief, this will not make us happy. Happiness is more likely when your partner is free to choose and chooses to love, chooses instead of being indifferent, but will willingly invest instead, who could be silent, but has their own opinions and ideas, and instead of always sacrificing and subordinating themselves, actually has things he or she wants as well, and will ask for them. Both individuals need to give, to serve, sacrifice, and care for. It's giving and receiving. That is what makes us happy. So what do we do to conclude from this? A lot of us enter marriage with some notions about what makes it work, and then discover that what we did not know is what is absent, and therefore what is needed. How would you answer if somebody asked you, what % of the time are you happy? Would you say 50%? Would you say 85%, maybe 90%? You might not think you are qualified to answer that question because your marriage is probably good in some areas and could be improved in others. But I have not met anyone yet who complains they have all the happiness they would like or that marriage offers. So I would like you to consider something. Virtually in every case, happiness in marriage can result from what one does and one does not do. It can also result from something that is a combination. What follows is so self-evident you might think it unnecessary for me to even explain. But people who are not happy typically fail to understand the principle involved. If we get involved with what I call a trap, then we are not avoiding what we should, and we are not doing what will bring us happiness. It is a trap, again, because it consumes energy we don't have for anything else. It consumes time we don't have for our marriage, and traps often consume resources we don't have for something else. I know of a man, for example, who spent up to 30 hours a week playing computer games. He had a network of friends and some acquaintances around the globe. In fact, there were so many people involved, they set up small organizations in several cities just to meet and talk over the intricacies of the game. Well, his wife was not happy with this. He was not happy in his marriage. He was in a trap, and he would not be happy as long as he continued what he was doing and realized that it could never bring marital happiness because it was not shared. In addition, the time he spent playing the game was time he could not and did not use for other possibilities. That is the way traps are. They do not create happiness by themselves, and they also prevent other people that might. Imagine with me how this will look. You would probably agree that to be happy, a married couple will need good communication, kindness, patience, a great deal of love, knowing how to give support, honesty, and many other qualities. If that is true then, and if you agree with me, why then do some of us engage in behavior which prevents good communication? We say mean things, express impatience, show less love than we would like, and fail to give support. Yet that is what many of us do. Why do you think that we do the things that bring us unhappiness? A lot of us are vulnerable to those things. Strange, isn't it? We do not come into a marriage with the necessary positive qualities already refined and ready to go. Most of us need to learn, and we hope the person we marry will be patient with us as we are patient with them. But still the question is, what do we do that makes us happy? Here's an example of how we learn that. We often learn by the very sad experience that happens if we do not say or do the right thing. We hurt people, or we fail to do what is necessary to have the best experience. While we are going through the process of catching on to what we need to avoid, we might also learn there are traps we can get ourselves caught in. And while engaged in these traps, we will learn that they never lead to happiness. Lying, for instance, has never been shown to produce lasting happiness. Neither has meanness, rejection, name-calling, or sarcasm. So how do we learn what does bring happiness in marriage? Well, we could learn from someone, read about it, or get some professional help, but even these might not work. According to our national statistics, approximately half of us do not learn what brings happiness before we break hearts or make problems bigger than they started out to be. So what do really happy people do that the rest of us might not? The answer might be interesting to you. If we can identify the traps that are negative things which prevent happiness, we can also better see what the good things are because they lift and fulfill us, and because they are actions and attitudes that are not traps. Instead, they free us, lift us, inspire us. In other words, what makes a marriage work well and produces happiness is not doing what prevents happiness so we can do what creates it. So let's identify the traps people can fall into so we will avoid those, and so we can identify the constructive and positive things we can learn and do. After all, married people marry for love and happiness, and most of us would like more of that than we currently have. Before doing that, though, I would like to tell you something to me that is greatly significant. There are an alarming number of married couples who think that happiness is the absence of problems. So if you ask them, they might say, things are going good. We have no problems. Would you be satisfied with that? Instead, I am proposing that even though we do not do something that hurts or dismays our partner, it is not just simply avoiding something that we must also actively live and do, invest and try, hope and imagine, serve and love. So I'm going to describe several traps and explain why they consume our time, energy, and emotional resources. Then I will offer what I believe will bring happiness instead, and I'm going to use supporting research to explain why people feel happier. I would also like you to understand something at the beginning. Feeling happiness is not automatic, and it is not the same for everyone. Some of us have limited capacities for it, and even though our partner knows all that is necessary, we might not feel very much of it. So if this is true for you, you or your partner might need to expand the capacity for happiness so that you can feel it full-blown, deep, and magnificent. I am proposing that if you will avoid the traps I describe and do what research suggests will create happiness, your capacity will gradually increase and you will be happy more of the time and feel it more intensely. Now, some of the traps I'm going to describe have been identified by Dr. Brent Barlow, a good friend and colleague who wrote the book 12 Traps of Marriage and How to Avoid Them. We will benefit from his expertise and experience. When you hear about the traps, you will probably see them as commonplace, and you might wonder what the big deal might be. Please keep in mind that studies regarding happiness for married people have identified these as conditions which prevent it. So let's take the first as an example. An example of a trap includes apathy and the absence of hope and pessimism versus optimism, encouragement, and trying to make things work out. I know, for example, of a woman who had been in an unhappy marriage until she had lost hope and began to feel apathetic. But she began to do a few positive things and began to feel happier, even though he did not respond to begin with. Then the question is, why was she more happy? She was happier because even engaging in constructive behavior on your own produces some form of happiness, even if it's not complete. So, how can you avoid apathy and the absence of hope? Well, when each person catches on to the idea that their efforts to proactively contribute to the marriage will make things better, it also creates a foundation to solve problems. So here's the deal. You get rid of blaming and you start doing constructive, positive things on your own. Start small, do one every so often and see if it improves the quality of your life. You might also then recognize that if you give up the language of apathy or pessimism about your marriage or your future, that it also creates a little bit of a better spirit and doesn't prevent people from looking forward to something that is worthwhile. Quite often, people talk themselves into a divorce by being pessimistic, by being openly hopeless about it, and both people hear the other and think, well, okay, then that's that. Here's number 2. Another trap is something that well known is called emotional dishonesty versus communicating honestly and forthrightly about things you hope for and want to see. We don't know for sure what the reasons are why people are not honest. But there is factual honesty where they're not honest about the facts. But also there's an emotional honesty where people are invited to say what they're feeling. It might simply be that they don't have the right vocabulary, but it might also be something suspicious. And in any case, failing to honestly communicate about your feelings will prevent your partner from accurately understanding you and will add errors in perceptions. This can be avoided by realizing that marriage is an emotional affair, and people are happier when they communicate about their feelings without blame, when they can be understood and then have their feelings matter to their spouse. If you don't do this much, then start slow, thank each other for talking, be positive, and keep going. Number 3. One of the most significant traps that many married people fall into who are also parents is to let their kids take over the marriage relationship versus organizing their own family and being leaders so that they work together as parents and provide the conditions for which children need to adapt to. When parents fail to parent their children adequately, there is profound unhappiness because they realize their inadequacy. Their children typically do not thrive, and everyone is confronted with the absence of a bright future filled with one with hope and positive things. Now you can avoid letting your kids take over your marriage and marriage relationship by working together as a marriage couple, or if you're a single parent, forming a clear idea of what kind of family you wish to build, what you hope for each child, and then lay out a plan to promote growth in your children and be consistent in doing so. In other words, you must act upon your family and your children rather than allow yourself to be acted upon exclusively. The next trap is commonly understood by virtually every married couple. It has to do with time. And it has to do with the idea of using marital time and sharing, spending an inadequate amount of time as a couple, which is necessary to maintain or improve the marriage, or just you're going to spend time with the distractions. Time is the least studied variable which influences humans. Because time passes, it cannot be recaptured, and so how we spend it matters a great deal. Happiness in marriage simply requires a certain amount of time shared with each other, unless people are separated for a very good reason. Now, failing to spend time when the opportunity exists is a trap, because suspicions rise, feelings of loneliness emerge, followed by some anger and frustration. You can avoid this problem by thinking through your priorities and establishing times when you'll be together and scheduling them, then legitimizing the right to ask for more time if you need it, and then agreeing that you will both agree to occasionally surprise the other with time to spend it with each other. Happiness is more likely when couples organize their time to ensure they are together and together in positive experiences. Both benefit. Number 5, tradition. Tradition, viewing new territory, and instead making the insistence that marriage today must be exactly as it has been in the past. Many people will insist that they carry out the traditions of their family of origin, or that they carry out traditional things that they particularly like as an individual. On the surface, that looks like a good thing sometimes, and often is, unless doing just those traditions prevents couples from creating their own. Part of happiness comes from a sense of adventure, newness, and exploration. You can avoid this trap of excessively applying tradition when both people express appreciation for the good traditions that come from each family, be selective about the traditions that fit your family, and create some that are new for yourselves. I don't know if you actually organize something that becomes traditional, but it could be a type of vacation at a certain location. It could be a type of a celebration that we repeat on an annual basis or a quarterly basis. But the important thing is that as a couple, you create some traditions of your own that show that you're willing to learn and participate in something new. Number 6, the trap is a problem with togetherness versus individuality. The trap is it's either having too little or too much to identify and fail to bond as a married couple. Togetherness often means different things to different people. A man may want to be together sharing some activity, while his wife may want to do something and be somewhere so they can talk. Too much togetherness and too much individuality can be a trap for both people. So the trap of an imbalance between togetherness and an individual time can be avoided by having some frank conversations about what you know to be true about yourselves, and agree that each person will be open about the times when they want some time alone and when they want to be together. When couples show their investment in the marriage by desiring to be together, it is easier to rest easy when one wants some time alone. The next one, number 7, is tenderness. This typically is not thought about very often. The problem is the inability or unwillingness of a married couple to be kind, loving, or caring or tender with each other, versus the idea that we are going to be kind, loving, caring, and tender with one another. So imagine, for example, that one of you have been indifferent or said something mean, and that a partner has created a feeling of sadness, and then is hurt for some reason. In these cases, tenderness is called for, showing that a spouse recognizes the situation that the other person is in, feels and shows some tenderness, which helps the victim, and then when the sadness ends, the happiness exists because of the tender kindness. Now suppose, in the same situation, Tenderness is not shown, and something else happens. So in the face of an individual feeling hurt, a person is indifferent, thinking the other person doesn't need any help or solace or attention or tenderness, or you're angry and resentful, and so you don't want to deliver it. So in this case, there is no happiness from either person, and the moment will have come and then pass. Well, how do you avoid the trap of failing to display tenderness when it's appropriate? A couple can discuss the importance of tenderness in marriage, deciding how it should be displayed and on which occasions. Remember that most people do not naturally know how or when to be tender, so it has to be explained. I would like to just emphasize here that it's an amazing number of cases where the reasons for discord have to do with the absence of tenderness when tenderness could and should be expressed. It almost seems unusual to me that in the face of somebody's hurt feelings or sadness or so on, the other person can't or won't express tenderness. But it is true that many of us do not know how to do that. But that problem or trap can be avoided if we talk about it, actually understand what it is, and then practice applying it. The next trap has to do with talking. The inability or unwillingness to do much more than exchange information with a marriage partner on a routine, day-to-day basis, that's the trap, versus a recognized need that talking often and sharing many things makes it possible for couples to maintain their relationship. Shutting someone out by not talking because you are not at peace with them becomes a trap of significant proportions. Quite often, this creates a pattern of rejection, and gradually over time it will frustrate the person who wishes to communicate and result in even less communication from the one who withdraws. I can think of an example where a woman was telling me that whenever she said something that offended her husband, he wouldn't talk to her. And so, thinking to inquire more about that, I said, how long? How's the longest time that he hasn't talked? And she said, she started to cry, and she said 3 months. And I can remember thinking, those are the hurtiest tears I have ever seen cried by anybody. Now, you can avoid this by putting communication high on your list and arrange times for it. And if you have to, schedule it and identify many occasions where talking with each other can be expected and realized. You're going to talk over a problem, talk about a decision, talk about just to keep each other informed about the day. Make a rule that says, I'm going to make a connection with you every single day. I'm going to talk on the weekends to plan for the next week. I'm going to talk over misunderstandings. In other words, we're going to talk on many occasions so we can avoid the trap of not talking when we should. The next trap I would like to discuss is called tyranny. Tyranny is the tendency of one marriage partner to exercise too much power or control in decision-making. Now, the opposite of that is making it clear and explicit that both people will be considered fairly and equally important. It just surprises me that the fear that underlies tyranny or excessive control doesn't seem to register on the person who is motivated by that. And so he or she thinks that exacting control, managing this, giving instructions, or regulating is simply the best way to get done what is desired. Well, it isn't. Tyranny becomes redundant and will continue unless there is a significant gesture indicating that it must stop. This can be avoided when one or both people look at themselves, and the one who is being controlled will courageously acknowledge that what is happening is hurtful and needs to end. I remember talking to a woman who described her husband as a tyrant, and he coupled this with the idea that he could physically shove and push her and sit her down when he wanted to talk with her. I asked if there were any medical records where she had been injured by him, and she said yes. And after acquiring a copy of that, then I proposed to her that she leave him and take the children and go to a safe place. She said in response, he'll find me. And so I said to her, leave him a note telling him that if he wants to get in contact with you, to contact me. That will enable him to know that there's a third party who knows what's going on. Well, she did that. And she went to a home in our city for battered women. And they provided support and encouragement and brought the two of them into counseling. He was simply unable to get rid of being a tyrant because in his mind, that was culturally the way a man treated a woman. So their marriage didn't last. Number 10 is turmoil. Turmoil is the inability of a married couple to deal constructively with marital conflict versus a couple understanding that some disagreements or some conflict is going to be expected and we should develop a method of how to handle that. So when turmoil exists, a couple might have a difference, it might have even an argument, and then it just continues to raise negative feelings that last hour after hour after hour. Some couples will go through periods of emotional stiffness, I call them, for as many as 4 or 5 days, and some longer than that, without realizing that the amount of time that they have dealt with conflict in this manner is wasted time. There is no happiness. There is no way of making things and apologizing or so on because we're just not going to communicate. So instead of turmoil, what we want is a problem-solving mechanism that allows people to come quickly to the problem, identify it, and solve it. And I have talked about that in another lecture. The idea of turmoil can be avoided if couples do the following. Agree that when there is a difference of opinion or an argument, they will discuss it within a agreed upon period of time less than 12 hours, usually 2 or 3 hours. 2, that they will agree that differences between the two of them are going to be resolved by both people having a say and both people being considered. And 3, they need to learn to make up with a way of making up their feelings and talking about the hurt or the frustration and forgiving each other and learn to do it as quickly as possible. You don't need to live in turmoil, and you don't need to make the unhappiness and misery of a marital conflict last for days and days at a time. Number 11 has to do with temper. Well, that should be obvious why that's a problem, but it often isn't. Temper is the inability or unwillingness of married partners to control, modify, or possibly eliminate anger in their relationship. Sometimes temper is learned as children and not unlearned as adults. And so when a person doesn't get things exactly the way he or she hoped for, or there's a frustrating moment or a difference of opinion, anger rises and there might be a small, medium form of display of anger, all the way to very explosive kinds of anger. Well, as it turns out, anger hurts people and confuses them and doesn't solve much of anything. But in a terrible fashion, sometimes when people are lonely and feel uncared for, stimulating the other person to get angry is actually kind of satisfying because it lets you know that they still have some emotional investment in the marriage. That is an advanced case of a trap. And as long as people participate in the temper and in the trap itself, then they're not going to use that same time to promote happiness in their marriage. So how do we avoid the idea? Well, once a person's temper is identified, one should not look past that or forget about that until help is given. So either the person who expressed it or the person who is affected by it needs to look steadily into the other person's face and say, "Sweetheart, I love you, and I love and care for you, but I'm not going to participate in these displays of temper anymore, and I don't want you to, so we have a choice to make. And the choice is us working together to solve this, or going and getting some help so that we can manage the anger." Now, if neither of these are acceptable to the person who has volatile anger, then the victim of that needs to get some external help, because anger is just 1 second or 2 away from some kinds of physical or emotional abuse. Well, how do we avoid angry episodes? By setting up a system of support and encouragement for the angry person, communicating clearly that I will support and care for you, but it needs to stop, and you don't reject the person who has the temper, but supports them. And then what you do is count the number of angry episodes. I can recall a farm couple in a nearby farming area, where she complained that her husband was often angry. And so I said, "Are you aware of that?" And he said, "Oh, I don't think I'm very angry." So I asked her to count the number of times in the following week, how many angry episodes took place. So she did, and when I met them again, I said, "Did you count?" And she said, "Yes." And I had 44 times by the middle of the week on Wednesday. And he could hardly believe that. And so he said, "Well, why? Prove that to me." And she had written the incident where he had expressed anger over a problem with a tractor, over the failure of some hired person who did his work well, and angry episodes inside the family. So realizing then and being confronted with the number of times he had expressed his angry temper, he began to go to work. And he learned ways of managing that so he didn't express anger and learned to express patience instead. It's a remarkable thing that happens when somebody has a volatile emotion like anger and receives the support and encouragement from somebody who loves them. You can turn anger into happiness if you go about it right. Number 12 is tension, real first-class tension. This usually happens because people participate in too many stress-producing projects or activities. And the opposite of that, of course, is to learn to balance life and to recognize that there will be moments or period of time that are highly stressful and therefore tense. But the reason why you do that is so that you can accommodate or make adjustments so that we know what's coming. The reason why tension and stress is a trap, a very significant trap, is this, is that in the human brain there are a set of emotions, some of which are inherited and some are learned. One of the inherited emotions, and therefore one of the most basic and primitive, has to do with anxiety, an anxiety which is close to tension and stress. Well, when the human brain is under a great deal of stress or pressure, the human brain typically will not release the emotion or the sensation of love, which typically is more of a learned emotion and a higher order end emotion. So people under a lot of stress or pressure, for example, experience more negative, frustrating, and difficult things and are less open to experiencing love. On one occasion, as a psychologist, a couple left my office, and their problem was that the man in this case had had an affair. He was a successful businessman. He had had an affair and realized that he wanted to reconcile with his wife, and they were seeking my professional services for help to do that. I realized that I had seen 5 couples that previous 4 or 5 months in a similar situation, and all of the perpetrators of the affair had been under sustained levels of tension and stress for months prior to the onset of the affair. And it was amazing to me to see the connection between the impact of stress and tension and the idea that there's somebody else who's more attractive and so on. So what do you do about tension? Well, it may seem that what you need to do is just regulate time to take you out of tension, give you time to rest and be at peace and so on. And most couples do that, or at least I hope that you will and you should. But that isn't the actual way to avoid it. The way to avoid it is to understand why you react with tension and stress. What are the circumstances that are toxic for you? So, for example, if I ask the question, who experiences more tension or stress, a manager or the employee that he supervises? You might think, well, the employee does, but it's not true. Research suggests that the employee actually experiences more tension and stress because he or she doesn't have a sense of control, which the manager does. So here's what you do. One way to avoid, allowing the trap of tension to prevent happiness is to organize and create things in your marriage that you can influence. But when I use the word control, I don't mean dominate your spouse, but that you can actually make happen. And then you discover that you're also able to find ways to reduce the tension by listening to music, by doing all sorts of constructive or positive things. In my case, realizing that sometimes I brought my tension into my home, and when I did, I didn't want to talk to anybody, and I didn't want to say anything angry or upset that would upset anyone. So I was just quiet. But the problem with being quiet, I was also not a good companion to be with or a good parent. So I decided that I would do the following, and it worked for me, and it's worked for many other couples. I agreed that on my way home, which is a 20-minute trip, not long compared to some, that I would pick a landmark out, and at that landmark I would no longer think about my work or anything related to it, and I would start thinking about my children, my wife, why I loved them, why I thought that was happy, and so on. Doing that, when I got near my home, I realized that I also needed to stop talking or thinking about my problems, the stresses, say, in my home. I just wanted to walk into my house and be fit as somebody who was going to be welcomed and love my kids and so on, and be the kind of person that I wanted to be in the evenings with my family. It took me 2 or 3 months to get good at that. And after I did that every single day, I sort of forgot about it because time had passed and I wasn't feeling a whole lot of tension or stress. One day I was driving the same route. I drove by that same landmark and I watched my body relax. And it made me laugh right out loud because I had conditioned myself to that landmark so that when I went by it, I had taught myself to relax and reduce the tension. Therefore, tension can be avoided, by learning a safe way to manage it and to recognize what it is. A lot of conflict is the result of tension or stress brought to the marriage by things external to the marriage. Number 13 is touch. The absence of touch in a marital relationship, other than for routine sexual relationships, is a real significant trap. I know that there are differences in terms of people wanting to touch or be touched. But in the communication dynamics of a marriage relationship, where the relationship is based on love and kindness and tenderness and support, the absence of touch or too much touch can be a significant trap. That's because the absence of it enables people to feel like they're uncared for and unappreciated, and in some cases, it's a turnoff where sex is concerned. When there's too much cleanliness, for example, then it isn't the idea that you're not appreciated. It's that you're not being affectionate, but your partner is being a dependent person instead. So the alternative to managing touch so it is not a trap is to have conversations about when you like it, what kind do you like it, and so on. A lot of women would like to have a lot of non-sexual liking and affection. One woman said, yes, I would like a lot of affection standing up. And both she and her husband laughed a little bit about that. But the point she was making was that she wanted to have affection and conversation and warmth in the totality of the experience. And her husband was one who just wanted the main course of the meal. And the point was that why would you deprive yourselves of anything that creates happiness and in some positive way makes a huge difference? So, avoiding the trap of touch, we are going to practice touching each other, doing it the right way, expressing affection and warmth, and when to do it, public or not public, and how to carry it out in a way that satisfies both. Simple conversation, you make an adjustment, you satisfy each person's request, and you can use touch to produce happiness. Number 14 is temptation. This also may seem obvious to you, but it's a surprising number of people who don't realize that they're in the middle of a tempting experience when they're gazing at the anatomy of some member of the opposite sex, or they're thinking about what it would be like if they were married to this person or that person. Temptation means that there's secret or questionable attitudes toward relationships with a member of the opposite sex that can lead to infidelity or adultery. Well, we would all say, well, that's unless you believe that those kinds of behavior build happiness in a marriage, all of us would agree that we should not participate in that kind of temptation. The question is, though, what is the very best form of behavior? Well, we know it as fidelity, faithfulness. The idea that I'm going to be faithful in my thoughts toward my spouse, and I hope my spouse will with me. And that we're going to manifest that faithfulness by displaying numerous ways to maintain the quality of the relationship. Now, instead of allowing temptation to affect us, allowing our minds and our visions to wander off to some other place, a couple can easily have a conversation that says, let's talk about how we're going to display and remember to be faithful in our thoughts and faithful in our actions to each other. This may seem a little corny to you because it's expected or should be expected to every person, but it would surprise you that the number of couples who complain the flirtatious behavior of a wife, the gazing behavior of a husband, and how distracting and unhappy that makes their marriage. Like other traps, it can become a pattern of behavior that makes happiness truly difficult to achieve. Number 15 is television and electronic devices. The trap, of course, is the excessive viewing of meaningless or improper television programs during hours that could be put to better use. See, a more modern take on this might be social media, how much time we spend on that. I think you'd be really surprised to find out how many married couples have sought for and found a high school flame, gotten in contact, began communicating with them, and then entered into temptation and risked the loss of their marriage relationship. It's surprising and it's substantial. But in addition to that, television and computers and other electronic devices have pornographic elements to them. And these pornographic elements can be easily predatory. And if you believe that pornography is okay and it will contribute to the quality of your marriage, then you wouldn't want to do what I'm going to propose. The absence of or failure to look at these negative sexually oriented or other kinds of troublesome videos is a sign of faithfulness and devotion. And the reason it is because it doesn't create unsavory feelings. Whereas a person will look at pornography, and individuals often feel a form of self-loathing following that because they've been involved with something that is simply not spiritually or emotionally uplifting. So it's not just the time spent on electronic devices, it's the content that individuals watch and pay attention to as well. And then, of course, time. If we spend a lot of time watching television, we're not spending time talking. If we're watching other kinds of video activities, then we're not doing other kinds of activities that might build and maintain a stronger, more happy and fulfilling marriage. So what do? I think nowadays people need to monitor the amount of time they spend with electronic devices because they typically are not relational in nature. You cannot, for example, if you're looking at a pornographic picture on a computer screen, you're having a response to a picture, not to another human. Or if you are having that kind of response and you're not talking and you're not touching and being affectionate, then you're not receiving the emotional support and the replenishing experience that your partner can provide you. So you monitor the amount, and then you may actually have to agree upon a set of time limits for each party. So, and if it becomes a problem where one is excessive or the other is or you're in the middle of something that is inappropriate, then you also have to agree to that and ask for help. Asking for help actually is a major way to overcome the idea that television and electronic problems can be a trap. Getting out of that and balancing that with other relational activities, see, is something in the modern era is absolutely crucial for us to do. I am a little dumbfounded as a practicing psychologist how many couples will start talking about a problem they presented as poor communication or they have a sexual problem or argument or conflict or something. And then if I ask how much time one or both spends on electronic devices, it's an interesting thing how as the years have passed, how the amount of time has actually increased. And so it has become a more acceptable diet, in my opinion, for many couples in the United States. So now in conclusion, I am going to propose to you that you take a look at these traps. You take a look at why they're traps and remember that they are traps because they consume resources and time and energy that could be used in some other way. They are traps because they become redundant patterns of behavior, and if repeated, they become inserted into your marriage relationship, and your marriage will be filled with one after another of these traps. Last, they can all be avoided if what we really care about is happiness. Because if you're committed to the idea of organizing your marriage to be truly happy and to make each other happy, then you will discover that avoiding these traps by doing the positive alternative is one of the most effective things you can do.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit FirstAnswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.